"Get your filthy hands off the champagne, janitor." The words dropped like poison into the crisp evening air, just as a crystal glass slipped from his hand, slapped away by the hostess with a flick of her manicured wrist. The champagne burst across the marble deck in a golden arc before shattering at his feet, its echoes swallowed by stunned silence. He didn't speak. He didn't bend. He only looked down at the broken shards reflecting the twilight, like fragments of something long buried but never forgotten. Around him, murmurs stirred, shoulders turned cold, faces twisted between discomfort and quiet approval. His shirt clung damp to his chest, the sting of public humiliation soaking deeper than the wine. She leaned closer, her voice a razor's edge dressed in silk. "People like you belong below deck, cleaning up after real guests." But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man she just humiliated was the only reason this yacht hadn't sunk years ago. The deck lights still shimmered behind him as he stepped away from the crowd, but Jalen Morris didn't look back. The salt air cut against his cheek, mixing with the sting of humiliation, but his footsteps were steady. No one recognized the man in the pressed black shirt, sleeves rolled up like hired help, name tag clipped discreetly to his belt. J. Morris, Event Services. That's exactly how he planned it. No last name on display. No entitlement. No special access. Just another background worker in a room full of peacocks. Beneath the modest badge, however, sat a truth none of them could afford to guess. Jalen was the controlling partner of Langston Holdings, the company that owned not only the yacht, but every contract that kept the guests' businesses afloat. And tonight, every step, every insult, every sideways glance was part of a test. His test. One that his late father had prepared him for long before he ever inherited a title. Years ago, when his father, Walter Morris, still walked the halls of Langston Holdings with quiet fire in his eyes, he told Jalen a truth most men weren't brave enough to admit. "It's not enough to know the numbers," Walter had said, his voice low, steady. "You need to know the people who mop the floors, refill the ice, carry the trays. Know what it feels like when no one holds the elevator door for you." At 17, Jalen hadn't understood. He had scholarships lined up, summers spent in London, and a future so gilded it seemed untouchable. But Walter saw the rot early. In boardrooms filled with polished smiles and partnerships bound by fragile ego. So he made a decision that shocked the family. When the time came, his son would not inherit by ceremony or surname. He would first disappear, live in the dust and silence, learn how arrogance blooms in plain sight, and how quickly the world turns when it believes you hold no power. So when Walter passed and the board demanded an emergency vote for succession, Jalen didn't step forward. Instead, he vanished, at least from the world they knew, gone with the tailored suits and corner office. In their place, night shifts as a maintenance contractor, morning meetings as a junior project analyst under a different name, and hours spent listening to the way executives spoke when they thought no one important was in the room. He had been everywhere and nowhere inside Langston Holdings for over a year. And now, just 2 weeks into his latest role embedded with their luxury hospitality division, he had all the confirmation he needed. The arrogance, the quiet cruelty, the way status flowed like currency, nothing had changed. Which is why tonight's yacht party wasn't just another social event. It was a mirror, a stage, and for the woman who shattered his glass and his silence, it would soon become a reckoning. The hostess's name was Victoria Langston, Executive Vice President of Operations, and the very person whose signature would be required to finalize the Zerani acquisition, one of the firm's most lucrative pending mergers. She didn't know the man she had just degraded was the one orchestrating the deal from behind closed doors, nor that he had quietly replaced 3 of her division leads in the past month. To her, he was invisible, and that was the entire point. Jalen wasn't here for vanity. He was here to see how deep the rot had spread. And now, thanks to her, he didn't need to look any further. He straightened his shirt, still damp at the chest, and walked toward the lower deck. Not out of shame, but strategy. He had seen what he came to see. And soon, every one of them, Victoria included, will be forced to see him for who he truly was. But by then, it would already be too late. Victoria's voice sliced through the corridor just as Jalen reached the service bay. "You, janitor, you missed a glass upstairs." Her heels clicked against the teak flooring like gunshots, trailing her as she descended in a silk cocktail dress that shimmered under deck lights. Elegance weaponized. Jalen turned slowly, careful not to show the fire rising beneath his collar. She was holding a damp towel like it was diseased, waving it toward him with theatrical disdain. "Do you know how much that carpet costs?" she continued, ignoring the glance of a passing server, who quickly looked away. "This isn't some budget hotel in North Haven. You're in a Langston event. Act like it." He held her gaze for a moment longer than expected, calm, unreadable, before taking the towel with a nod. "Yes, ma'am." It was all he said, and it was all she needed to feel superior. She turned with a satisfied scoff, completely unaware she'd just handed her future to the man cleaning up after her. As Victoria disappeared back toward the upper deck, Jalen folded the towel once. Then again, his hands calm though his mind was a flurry of calculations. He had spent the last 2 weeks watching her, how she barked orders, how she belittled junior staff, how her smile only appeared when cameras did. But tonight something had shifted. She wasn't just careless. She was threatened. Ever since whispers of leadership change had begun to circulate in private investor circles, she'd grown more irritable, more erratic, snapping at anyone who didn't cower fast enough. And now, faced with a man she assumed powerless, she let her mask slip entirely. Jalen made a mental note of every word she said, every insult, every sneer. Not out of revenge, but for the record, because when the board would eventually ask him why she had to go, he wanted to be able to say, "I gave her a chance to show grace." She chose the opposite. As the night unfolded above, murmurs drifted down through the stairwell. Laughter, clinking glasses, the soft thud of jazz spilling from mounted speakers. But in the crew passage near the galley, the energy was different. A young server passed by Jalen, eyes darting nervously, mouth half open as if to apologize for witnessing what just happened, then quickly lowered her gaze and moved on. Another staffer leaned against the wall, pretending to check his phone, though his ears were clearly trained toward the exchange that had just ended. It wasn't just Jalen who had seen Victoria's mask slip. People noticed. They always did, but few spoke. And that silence, that culture of complicity, was exactly why Langston Holdings had begun to rot from the inside out. Jalen didn't need anyone to fight for him tonight. He needed them to remember. Remember who kept the ship running, who made sure paychecks cleared, and soon, who would decide whether their division rose or quietly disappeared. Later that evening, as the speeches wrapped and guests migrated toward the dessert bar, Victoria passed Jalen again near the side deck stairs. She didn't slow, didn't glance, just tossed out words like candy from a moving car. "If you people learn to clean as well as you multiply, maybe we wouldn't need quarterly recarpeting." The sentence hit the air with a thud, too loud, too sharp, too racist to hide behind any polite laugh. Jalen stopped walking. So did the server 2 steps behind her. A junior account manager from acquisitions, mid-bite of a canopy, froze mid-chew. For a moment, only the music moved. And then, as if nothing had happened, Victoria vanished back into the glittering crowd. But the echo of her voice remained, suspended in salt air and disbelief. Jalen didn't say a word. He didn't need to, because sometimes the most powerful response is letting someone hang themselves with their own unchecked tongue. By the time dawn crept across the marina, subtle tremors had already begun to ripple through the Langston ecosystem. 3 regional managers, ones Victoria had personally fast-tracked, were suddenly removed from the internal directory. Their access badges no longer scanned at headquarters. No formal announcements. Just silence, efficient and surgical. Only a few insiders noticed the pattern. Compliance reviews triggered, performance audits requested, calendar invites redirected, all tied back to the same obscure sender, J. Morris Systems Oversight. Of course, no one connected it to the man wiping champagne from deck chairs just hours earlier. And that was by design. Jalen hadn't simply walked into the company as a ghost. He'd embedded himself at every level, from IT backdoors to janitorial scheduling. What looked like maintenance logs were actually behavioral reports. What seemed like inventory forms masked internal intel. While Victoria polished her ego in spotlight, Jalen had spent over a year building an invisible web, and now was beginning to tighten. 2 days later, during a leadership huddle at Langston's downtown headquarters, Victoria noticed something off. The room, usually a predictable cycle of praise and passive nodding, was stiff. Conversations paused when she entered. Eyes didn't meet hers as easily. Even her assistant, Jenna, who always brought her coffee with one sugar and a nervous smile, was uncharacteristically quiet. "Did I miss a memo?" Victoria asked, half joking. No one laughed. On the conference screen, a new compliance tracker had appeared, one she didn't recognize. Underneath, a line of small gray text read, "Audit triggers reviewed by special internal oversight." It was signed with an unfamiliar alias, JM. She stared at the initials, a flicker of annoyance dancing behind her lashes. "Who authorized this?" she asked, sharper now. Silence. The head of HR cleared his throat, but didn't speak. That's when it hit her, not fully but enough. Something was moving beneath the surface. And for once, it wasn't under her control. That afternoon, as Jalen walked the logistics corridor beneath the executive floor, a voice called out, low, deliberate, "You're not who you say you are." He turned to see Miles Rennick, a senior risk analyst known for his paranoia and eerily accurate predictions. The man leaned casually against a filing cabinet, eyes scanning for cameras. "I've been tracking system metadata," he said, almost casually. "Jay, Morris doesn't exist in HR records prior to 14 months ago, but your name appears in audit logs dating back 5 years. Buried, encrypted, but there." Jalen didn't flinch. He just looked at Miles, his expression calm. "And what do you think that means?" Miles shrugged. "I don't know. But the last time someone manipulated logs that cleanly, the board had to pay out a settlement with 6 zeros. He paused. "I don't care what game you're playing, but if I were Victoria, I'd start watching my back." With that, Miles walked away, leaving behind more questions than answers. The next morning, Victoria summoned an emergency strategy meeting. The invitation bypassed usual protocols. No agenda, no prep deck, just a terse subject line, reorg briefing, mandatory attendance. It was a power play, the kind she used when she felt cornered. Inside the glass-walled boardroom, she stood with arms folded, eyes sweeping across department heads like a general surveying troops. "There's been too much noise," she began. "Leaks, gossip, irrelevant audits. We're tightening our ship starting now." Her voice was sharp, but not steady. And Jalen, dressed in maintenance grays, was watching from behind a one-way mirror on the adjacent floor, because this entire room was being recorded. Installed under the guise of facility modernization, the AV system now fed directly to his encrypted review portal. Victoria had just publicly admitted to obstructing oversight. She thought she was reclaiming control. But with every word, she added fuel to the very file that would soon dismantle her. Brick by brick, she was helping him build the case. That evening, Victoria arrived early to a closed-door investor briefing at the Halbert Club, an elite venue where deals were whispered over $900 wine. As she stepped into the private lounge, her breath caught. Seated at the far end, in a tailored navy suit, was the janitor. No, not the janitor. The man she thought was the janitor. Hair trimmed sharp, watch gleaming under crystal lighting, posture calm and unnervingly assured. He wasn't cleaning floors. He was reviewing documents. Next to him sat Harold Givens, the firm's largest outside shareholder, laughing softly as Jalen slid a folder across the table. Victoria stepped back behind a velvet column, pulse climbing. No, she whispered to herself. That can't be him. But it was. In a moment he glanced toward the entrance. Just the flick of an eye. No smile. No acknowledgement. She knew. Knew she had miscalculated. Knew that whatever this man's real title was, it outranked her by miles. And now, she had no idea how much time she had left. Jalen left the club 15 minutes later, briefcase in hand. Phone pressed lightly to his ear. It's time, he said simply. On the other end, a voice replied, We're ready. That night, 3 key department servers were migrated under new digital credentials, authorized by an internal clause that hadn't been touched in over a decade. One only the board chair or acting CEO could enact. By morning, half of Victoria's authority had been rerouted. Her calendar was wiped. Her access to contract dashboards disabled. HR flagged her travel card. Compliance requested her signature on a backlog of quarterly filings she hadn't reviewed in months. One by one, the strings holding her image together began to fray. She stormed into legal just before noon, demanding answers. But all she got was a copy of the operating agreement with a new name listed at the top. Jalen A. Morris, interim CEO, Langston Holdings. The board hadn't just moved on. They had chosen their next leader, and he had been right beneath her nose all along. The executive boardroom was unusually full that morning, packed with regional leads, partners, legal counsel, and a few nervous faces from compliance. Everyone had received the same urgent summons. Leadership realignment briefing, 9 a.m. sharp. At 8:58, the door opened. But it wasn't Victoria who walked in. It was Jalen. He stepped through the glass entry, not in his faded work shirt, but in a custom charcoal suit that hugged his frame like second skin. No badge, no clipboard, just a calm, precise man with a leather folio and steel in his eyes. Conversations froze. Chairs stiffened. One executive actually stood, as if unsure whether to object or salute. Victoria arrived 10 seconds later, heels clacking like a warning bell, until she saw him. She stopped mid-step. What is he doing here? She blurted, louder than she meant to. Jalen turned slowly, eyes meeting hers. Ms. Langston, he said evenly, you're just in time. I believe you'll want to hear this. Silence dropped like a curtain. Jalen set the folio on the table, opened it with a single motion, and slid a stack of printed documents across the polished wood. These, he said calmly, are detailed audit findings from the past 12 months, conducted under board-sanctioned investigative authority. You'll find misappropriated discretionary budgets, falsified performance reports, and unauthorized bonus allocations, all tied directly to Ms. Langston's division. Gasps stirred the room, followed by the metallic clink of someone's pen dropping to the floor. Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. Her voice, when it finally came, was thin. This is absurd. That's internal data. How would he even have access? She turned toward the general counsel, but the man didn't speak. He simply reached into his folder and retrieved a signed board memo, dated weeks ago, officially appointing Jalen Morris as acting CEO. He has access, he said softly. All of it. Jalen didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just nodded, then looked back toward Victoria. This is just the beginning. Jalen reached into his inside pocket and pulled out a small remote. With a click, the lights dimmed and a speaker embedded in the ceiling came to life. The room filled with the unmistakable echo of Victoria's voice. If you people learn to clean as well as you multiply, gasps rippled like a wave across the table. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Another quietly muttered, Jesus. Jalen let the silence stretch after the recording ended. No commentary, no embellishment. Just truth, unvarnished. Victoria's face drained of color. That was taken out of context, she stammered. You had no right. It was on company property, Jalen cut in smoothly. At a company event. And your remarks weren't just unethical. They exposed Langston Holdings to legal liability, PR disaster, and internal unrest. His voice was calm, surgical. Tell me, Victoria, how do you suggest we explain this to our diversity partners? Or to the media when this leaks in, let's say, 48 hours? She said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Jalen let the silence breathe for a moment longer, then calmly returned to his seat at the head of the table, a seat that, until today, no one had imagined him occupying. He folded his hands and looked around the room. Effective immediately, he said, his tone composed but resolute. Ms. Victoria Langston is suspended from all duties pending a full investigation. Legal and HR will coordinate a transitional plan by end of day. No one interrupted. No one objected. Even those who had once laughed at his uniform now sat rigid, eyes lowered. He continued, this company was built on the back of integrity. My father believed that power meant responsibility, not entitlement. Somewhere along the way, we lost that. Starting today, we rebuild. He stood, not from the top down, but from the floor up. There was no applause, no celebration, just a weighted stillness, as if the entire organization had taken a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. The man they dismissed as invisible had just taken control of everything. Victoria didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, eyes wide and distant, as if the ground beneath her had vanished. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the chair beside her, but missed. No one offered to help. For years, she had ruled through fear, through manipulation masked as elegance. And now, stripped of her illusions, she was just another executive who went too far. Just as she turned to leave, a voice broke the silence. Mr. Morris. It was Jenna, her assistant. The same young woman who had once delivered coffee with shaking hands, who had quietly endured Victoria's cold commands. I'm sorry, she said, stepping forward, eyes meeting his. I knew she was wrong. I should have said something sooner. Jalen looked at her, not with triumph, but with calm understanding. You just did, he said, and in that moment, something shifted. The boardroom was no longer just a place of exposure. It was becoming a space for accountability. As the boardroom slowly emptied, Jalen remained seated, eyes scanning the skyline through the tall glass windows. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between relief and readiness. But just as he reached for his tablet, a shadow appeared in the doorway. Quite the entrance, a familiar voice said. Jalen turned. It was Richard Langford, former chairman, longtime friend of his father, and Victoria's uncle. You waited a long time to strike, Richard continued, stepping inside. Walter would have been proud. Jalen stood, measured. This wasn't about revenge, Richard. It was about correction. The older man nodded slowly. I believe you, but I hope you understand. Victoria was never the real threat. Jalen's brow tightened. Then who was? Richard paused at the threshold, eyes narrowing. The people who protected her, the ones who never showed their faces until the moment you disrupt their money. And with that, he left. Alone now, Jalen looked out over the city, knowing one truth more clearly than ever. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. 3 days later, Jalen entered the private boardroom at Meridian Equity Bank, neutral ground for high-level negotiations. The room was smaller, quieter than Langston's, but the air was heavier. Around the table sat 5 men and 1 woman, none with titles on the door, yet each one controlling portfolios that dwarfed Langston's by billions. These were the real players, the ones who had whispered Victoria into power, the ones who never cared about leadership, only leverage. One of them, a man in a gray suit with polished nails, leaned forward. We don't like disruptions, he said plainly. You've created one. Jalen met his gaze. What you call disruption, I call accountability. The man smirked. Langston isn't just yours, Mr. Morris. We have interests, agreements, long-standing arrangements. Jalen nodded once, which I've reviewed. He opened his folder and laid out a new charter, co-signed by a majority vote from the independent shareholders, and amended. Around the table, hands twitched. Expressions hardened. The game had changed, and they knew it. Jalen remained standing as the room shifted uncomfortably. He let the silence hold, then slid a second document forward, this one thinner, but far more dangerous. This, he said, is a compiled report of every discretionary payout, offshore transfer, and shell partnership that traces back to accounts under your collective influence. Some of it is technically legal. Most of it isn't. One of the men chuckled darkly. You think blackmail gets you leverage? No, Jalen said evenly. I think sunlight does. He pointed to a sealed envelope beside the file. Inside is a press release. Fully documented. With names. It goes live at noon. Unless we reach an understanding. The woman at the table finally spoke. And what would that understanding look like? Jalen looked at her without blinking. You divest. Quietly. Over 6 months. No panic in the markets. No interference in Langston Holdings. In exchange, your names stay clean. Your empires remain untouched. For the first time all morning, no one said a word. Because they knew they'd already lost. That evening, long after the signatures were sealed and the deals quietly dismantled, Jalen stood on the rooftop terrace of Langston Tower, staring out at the city his father once ruled in silence. The wind was sharp, honest. Behind him, a soft voice broke the stillness. You did it. He turned. It was Savannah Brooks, his father's former advisor, now head of internal ethics. She'd always known who he was, even when he scrubbed floors with a mop instead of a mandate. Was it worth it? She asked gently. Jalen didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, still steady, but somehow heavier than before. It wasn't about proving I could lead, he said finally. It was about learning why I should. Savannah nodded. And now that you know? He looked at her, eyes quieter than victory. Now I know the cost. And I know I never want to become what I just defeated. For the first time in weeks, he exhaled and meant it. Weeks passed. The news never broke. The press release remained sealed. But inside Langston Holdings, the change was undeniable. Employees who once walked with eyes down now lifted their heads. Policies were rewritten. Salaries rebalanced. The janitor's closet Jalen once used was turned into a mentorship room. For interns, for overlooked voices, for second chances. One afternoon, as he passed the operations floor, he saw Jenna leading a training session. Confident, composed, her voice no longer trembling. She caught his eye and smiled. Jalen smiled back. He kept walking. No need for titles. No need for credit. The world wouldn't remember the speeches or the suits. But maybe, just maybe, it would remember something more. That real leadership isn't loud. It doesn't wear a badge. It listens when no one else will. It stands when others shrink. And sometimes it mops the floor before it takes the helm. So it never forgets where the dust gathers. And why it matters to clean it right.